In a shocking turn of events, two police officers are caught on video humiliating and tying up a black man, unaware that their victim is actually one of their own, a police chief. The incident, which begins as a routine traffic stop, quickly escalates into an appalling display of racial bias and abuse of power. What starts as a simple interaction between law enforcement turns into a moment of reckoning, one that no one could have predicted. The two officers, fueled by their own prejudices, believe they are in complete control. But what they don't know is that the man they've targeted is someone who holds the authority to expose their actions. As the situation grows more tense and the officer's behavior becomes increasingly erratic, the true identity of the man remains hidden. The moment he reveals who he really is, a high-ranking police official, the power dynamic shifts in an instant. How will these officers react when they realize the person they've wronged is someone who could destroy their careers? The story raises critical questions about authority, racism, and justice within law enforcement. Stay tuned for the full story as the consequences of this encounter unfold in a way no one could have predicted. Will this shocking act of humiliation lead to change, or will it simply be another tragic example of abuse in the system? The tension in the air was thick as the two officers, oblivious to the man's true identity, continued their brutal treatment. The black man, though visibly shaken, remained calm, trying to de-escalate the situation, hoping somehow that the officers would realize they were making a grave mistake. But the officers were blinded by their own assumptions, their actions fueled by a toxic mix of racism and unchecked power. They thought they were in control, but little did they know, they were playing a dangerous game with someone who knew exactly how to fight back. It wasn't long before the situation spiraled out of control. As the officers roughly cuffed him and forced him into the back of their squad car, they exchanged mocking words, unaware that their victim was a leader in the very system they represented. The man's calm demeanor had fooled them, as they assumed he was just another black man they could easily intimidate. But beneath the surface, there was a sense of quiet confidence that couldn't be shaken. As the man sat silently in the back of the car, his mind raced. He was weighing his options, knowing that exposing his identity could turn the tide in an instant, but also wondering what kind of backlash he might face. Would his colleagues stand by him, or would they turn a blind eye to the abuse within their own ranks? The more he thought, the more he realized that this moment could either be a turning point or the beginning of a battle that could consume him. As the man sat there, every second felt like an eternity. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but the silence in the car was deafening. His mind replayed the moments before everything went south, how he had been pulled over, how the officers had approached him with hostile aggression. It wasn't just a routine stop, it had felt personal. He had tried to remain composed, knowing that his reactions could dictate the outcome of this encounter, but now, as he sat there handcuffed, he realized just how little control he had over his own fate. In another part of the city, the officer's partner, Officer Davis, was growing uneasy. She had noticed something off about the whole interaction from the start. The man they had pulled over had been calm, but not in the way someone would act if they were guilty or hiding something. His stillness was unsettling, almost as if he knew something they didn't. She had been uncomfortable with how quickly her partner had escalated the situation, and though she had kept quiet at first, now doubt was creeping into her mind. What if they were wrong? What if they had made a mistake? She glanced at her partner, but his face was set in determination, convinced they had everything under control. Davis could feel the tension rising inside her as she tried to suppress a growing discomfort. But even more troubling was the nagging feeling that the man wasn't who they thought he was. What if he was more than just a victim? What if he had power they couldn't see or understand? Back in the car, the man's thoughts were consumed by the precarious position he found himself in. He had dedicated his life to making the system better, to eradicating the very thing that had led to this moment. But now he wondered if it was even possible. Could one person make a difference in a world where so many were complicit in perpetuating the very systems they were supposed to dismantle? The man clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He had a duty to uphold, but in this moment, it felt like he was helpless. The minutes dragged on, each one adding a layer of suffocating weight. The man could hear the faint hum of the engine, but it did little to ease the tension. His mind raced, torn between the responsibility he held as a police chief and the undeniable injustice unfolding before him. He thought about his family, his colleagues, and how the truth, once revealed, could send shockwaves through the very system he worked to protect. But there was no turning back now. He could feel the tight grip of the cuffs cutting into his wrists, a constant reminder of how fragile the situation was. Officer Davis sat in the front seat, her gaze flickering nervously toward the rearview mirror, where she caught glimpses of the man in the back. There was something about him that she couldn't shake. She had dealt with her share of routine stops before, but this one felt different, too wrong, too charged with something she couldn't quite pinpoint. Her partner, Officer Brooks, had been steadfast in his actions, but Davis couldn't ignore the growing unease inside her. Every moment that passed without a word from their prisoner made her more convinced they were dealing with someone far more significant than they realized. Brooks, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the growing tension within his partner. He was too focused on what he believed was a clear-cut situation. He'd taken control, and in his mind, the man was just another statistic in a broken system. What could possibly go wrong? Then, as the car turned down an empty street, the silence was shattered. The man, his voice steady yet filled with an unmistakable authority, spoke up for the first time since the stop. "You don't know who I am, do you?" The words hit like a lightning bolt, catching both officers off guard. Davis froze, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio. Brooks tensed, his gaze snapping to the rearview mirror. The man's voice was calm, but there was an underlying power to it that sent a chill down their spines. "I'm the chief of police. You've made a grave mistake." Davis' breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded as realization began to sink in, but it was too late. Brooks' face twisted in disbelief, his confidence quickly crumbling as he tried to process what he was hearing. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air between them crackled with the tension of a power dynamic turned on its head. The man had revealed his identity, and now everything was about to change. But how would they react? Would they panic? Would they try to cover their tracks? Or would the truth finally come to light, exposing the ugly undercurrent of racial bias and corruption within their own ranks? The questions lingered in the thick, charged air, leaving everyone in the car bracing for the storm that was about to hit. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their revelation. For a moment, the car was silent, save for the steady hum of the engine. Brooks' hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles pale, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He glanced at Davis, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on the rearview mirror, her face ashen. It was clear that the man in the back wasn't just anyone. But even more unsettling was the cold realization that they had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Davis opened her mouth, as if to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She had always been uneasy with the way the system worked, but now that unease had transformed into full-blown panic. What was she supposed to do now? Would this man go straight to the media? Would he take down every officer involved in this abuse? The fear of what might happen next was overwhelming, but just as quickly, a new thought surfaced. What if he didn't? What if he kept silent, protected the system instead of exposing it? Brooks was trying to think fast, but his mind was clouded by a surge of anger and fear. He couldn't let this slip, not now. He had too much to lose. "You're lying," he spat, his voice shaking with desperation. "No way you're a chief. You think we're just supposed to let you go because of who you are." Before the man could respond, the situation took an even darker turn. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Unit 5 to 2, report status. We have a 10 to 15 in progress. Backup needed." The voice on the other end was calm, but the urgency was palpable. Brooks froze, his eyes widening in horror. Davis, too, felt the tension spike as she glanced at him, the realization dawning on her. Someone else was listening. Someone outside the car, outside their control, had just been alerted to the situation. The man had more power than just his position. He could call for backup, and the entire situation could unravel in a heartbeat. Davis' heart raced. "We have to get him out of here," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. Brooks didn't reply. His mind was spinning, trapped between saving face and saving himself. The radio was still on, the crackling static now, an unsettling reminder that their every move could be under scrutiny. He knew he couldn't afford to let this slip. The stakes had just been raised higher than he ever imagined. With the police chief's identity now confirmed, everything was on the edge. The tension between duty and fear was unbearable. But what neither officer realized was that someone had already started investigating. Someone who had been watching them all along. And as the story began to break open, the consequences of their actions would stretch far beyond what they could ever anticipate. Would they become the hunted, or would they somehow find a way to bury the truth before it consumed them? The clock was ticking. The car came to a sudden, jarring halt. Brooks' hands were shaking as he reached for the radio. But before he could make a move, the man in the back seat spoke again, his voice cool and calm, but carrying a weight that made both officers tense. "You're not getting out of this. Not like this." Davis' heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with every passing second. There was no way out of this now. She had a choice to make: stay silent, or stand up and risk everything. Her hand hovered over her radio, unsure if she should call for help or let the situation play out. But before she could make a decision, the man continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I didn't want it to come to this, but you forced my hand." His eyes locked onto Davis through the rearview mirror, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of his resolve. This wasn't just about power, it was about justice. Brooks, now visibly sweating, turned to Davis, panic creeping into his eyes. "We can't. He's going to ruin us," he hissed, voice barely audible. But it was too late for denial. The situation had spiraled too far. The radio crackled again, and this time, a voice came through that neither officer expected. "Unit 5-2, we've got a full investigation going on here. We have backup on the way, but you'll be relieved to know we've been watching. This goes deeper than you think." Brooks froze. His blood ran cold. Davis felt a knot form in her stomach as the words sunk in. Someone within the force had been aware of their every move. The man in the back seat let out a quiet chuckle, as if reading their minds. "You thought you were in control, but the truth's already out. They've known about this corruption for weeks." He paused, savoring the moment. "You weren't the only ones watching. I had someone in your ranks too." Just as the words hit them, a police car appeared in the rearview mirror. It was the backup, but they weren't coming to help Brooks and Davis. They were there to make sure the truth was exposed. The man in the back was no longer the victim. They had become the ones under scrutiny. Brooks shot one last, desperate look at Davis, but she couldn't meet his eyes. The moment of truth had come, and there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. As the backup officers stepped forward, the story had fully unraveled. Everything they had worked so hard to hide was now out in the open. And then, just as they were about to be taken into custody, the final twist came. The backup officer in charge, who had been silently observing from a distance, pulled off his sunglasses, revealing his own badge. The same badge the man in the backseat held. He wasn't just a police chief. He was an undercover agent sent to expose the very corruption within their ranks. With a nod to the officers who had just arrived, he motioned for them to step back. "You're not the ones who are going to be in control anymore," he said coldly. The final betrayal was now complete.